is going to be finishing his series of the Bible and or kind of the main points of what every progressive Christian should know about the Bible.
Part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2, 5:45.
Very excited. If you did not see part 1, it's on YouTube. It's awesome. So this is like scholarly level stuff. You won't hear a lot of this in churches, so I think you're really going to enjoy it. Let's all give Bernie a round of encouragement. All right.
So, aside from the usual dose of heresy today, we're going to have some scholarly endeavor, some joint collaborative scholarly endeavor as well, as we parse out two of the major pieces of the book of Genesis. The first words of Genesis, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," have great salience in American culture. So much so that the Apollo 8 astronauts did a live reading of the first 10 verses of Genesis on Christmas Eve, 1968, as they were approaching the moon for the first time in human history. There's a problem, however. According to Michael Coogan, one of the preeminent Hebrew Bible scholars, the proper translation would be, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth," or even more literally, "In the beginning of God's creating." This slight change makes it clear that God, or Elohim in the original Hebrew, was not creating out of nothing, but instead is narrating the formation of the cosmos and ordered universe out of pre-existing but chaotic matter, referred to in the text as the deep in Genesis 1:2. The traditional translation of verse 1, "In the beginning God," according to Coogan, owes to the desire of the original King James Version's translators, who completed their work in 1611, to align this verse with the opening "in the beginning" language in the first verse of the Gospel of John in the Christian New Testament. We learned last time that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible were written over the course of about 400 years by at least 4 different authors writing in different historical contexts, each promoting different political agendas. As was shown by Veronica's reading, the oldest source tells a very different story, which is curiously at odds with the more recent version contained in Genesis 1. This earliest of the Israelite creation narratives begins in the second half of Genesis 2:4. This is the familiar Adam and Eve story, and begins, "On the day that Yahweh made the earth and the heavens, no wild shrub was yet on the earth, and no wild plant had yet sprouted, for Yahweh had not made it rain on the earth, and there was no human to work the ground. Then the Lord God Yahweh formed the human from the soil of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." Here, there is no mention of a pre-existing deep, but instead a depiction of pre-existing dry earth. Like the later narrative, though, the deity is acting on pre-existing matter, not making something from nothing. As we'll see next time, that idea of creating something from nothing would not emerge until another 4 centuries had elapsed. In the earliest Hebrew narrative, Yahweh observes that it is not good that man should be alone, so I will make him a helper as his partner. The deity next forms out of the ground every animal of the field and every bird of the air. The animals and birds were formed out of the ground, just as with the creation of man. The creation of animals and birds is not merely to create animals and birds, but, by the express text, was to create a helper and partner for the man. Yahweh brings all the animals and birds to the man to be named, but for the man there was not found a helper as his partner. So Yahweh creates a woman out of one of the man's ribs. There are many differences between the priestly source, creation story in Genesis 1, written in the 6th century BCE, likely during the Babylonian captivity, and the Yahweh story in Genesis 2, around the time of King David and King Solomon. In the J story, the deity is very anthropomorphic, while the P story envisions the deity much more abstractly and more remote. Elohim speaks creation into existence with no apparent effort or expenditure of energy. Yahweh, in contrast, actively forms the creations out of pre-existing dust of the ground and planted a garden. The most noticeable contradiction, however, concerns the order of creation in the two accounts. In the P story, Elohim creates all the birds, sea creatures, and then land animals. Then, in their final creative act, they simultaneously create the male and female humans in Elohim's image. In the J story, in contrast, Yahweh creates man, then the animals and birds, and finally woman. As Coogan notes, it is impossible to reconcile these two accounts. They cannot both be true. Coogan opines that this would have been obvious to the ancient readers as well, showing that they, unlike Bill Bjorkman from my last sermon, could not have regarded these conflicting stories as literally true. Another instructive exercise is to take a close look at the Genesis flood stories. And I say stories in the plural for a reason. I'll take a break for you to look at two flood stories. Look at the earliest first, written by the J writer at the same time as the Adam and Eve story, and then read the priestly version of the flood story and see if you can spot the differences. Form into smaller groups if you'd like. Here's your chance to do some scholarly exegesis of the text. All right, so I saw Betty just finished up with that long second story, even longer than the first. And I heard her exclaim when she got to the word raven. So anyway, what are some of the differences between these two stories? The timeline's different. Where did the ark come from in each story? In the first story, the ark is just there, just out of nowhere. Apparently God just, put it there. And so that's another difference. Yeah.
There's no promise to not have a flood.
In which story?
The second one, the priestly.
The priestly story. Yeah. So no promise. What about the number? How were the animals paired up? Is it just
female priestly riders, but then there was a bunch of different groups.
What's a clean animal and what's a not clean animal?
well, you got to read Leviticus 11 for that. So you just have to know to do that. But if have you ever heard the term kosher? So we know that our Jewish friends put a high premium on being kosher. And Leviticus 11 explains to you that, if you're Jewish or if you were an ancient Israelite, no pork for you, no lobster, no shellfish of any kind, no horse meat. So that's clean and unclean. And theologians and anthropologists have puzzled over their mind of where did the ancient Israelites come up with their notions of what constituted clean food and unclean food. But that's still a big debate we won't bother with today. But which one brought 7 animals of each kind into the ark? That was the Yahweh story, where only 2 of each kind comes in the priestly story. So, but the other thing that is, interesting about parsing out the two stories from the way they actually appear, if you go to Genesis 6:5 and read on through Genesis 8, what you'll find is a story that frankly is just a slapdash, incoherent mess. Whereas these two stories, whatever you otherwise think of them, they're coherent narratives. And that was one of the ways that scholars, over the last 400 years figured out, hey, wait a minute, there are two stories here, and they've been sliced and diced and thrown together for some reason. And that, what that reason was is still much debated. But at any rate, the idea that the first 5 books of the Bible were written, in some cases by a committee. The priestly source, it was probably the priestly class that was coming together with their committee version of how they wanted the story to read. The Yahwist, some scholars argue she was actually a woman, in the court of Rehoboam, which would have been one of the kings after Solomon. So that, there's, feminist theology will, point to the various reasons why you can see the hints of a womanly authorship in the J source. And that's all much debated as well. The famed literary critic at Yale that just died, Harold Bloom, was famous for promoting the idea that J was a woman. Much to the annoyance of Richard Friedman, whose scholarship we're relying on here, because they said, hey, I had that idea first, and you didn't give me credit. But at any rate, so now that you've dissected the flood stories, I recommend you watch the recent Russell Crowe version of Noah, which gives a whole other take on the Noah story.
Actually showed
What was that?
It actually showed evolution.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a terrible movie. It's an awful movie.
So, for most of history subsequent to Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century of the Common Era, these Genesis creation stories were the primary ones on offer. That changed in 1853 when Hormuz Rassam discovered some broken clay remains in the library of King Ashurbanipal, a 7th century before the Common Era ruler of ancient Assyria. There was an archaeological dig underway in the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital city of the Assyrian Empire, which are just across the Tigris River from contemporary Mosul, Iraq. The significance of Rassam's discovery would take another 2 decades to decipher, but George Smith, in late 1872, realized that the find narrated the epic journey of Gilgamesh, who was on a quest for the source of immortality, a quest motivated by the death of his friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh nearly succeeds when he obtains a magic plant that will give him immortality. But alas, he falls asleep and a snake steals the plant, condemning him and by extension all humanity to the fate of mortality. The epic also contains a flood narrative, similar to the one in Genesis 7 and 8, but much older, probably by at least 1,000 years and perhaps more. Since Rassam's discovery, many more versions of the Gilgamesh epic have been found throughout Mesopotamia proper, and in Turkey, Syria, Israel, and even in Megiddo, the site where evangelicals believe the final conflict between good and evil, envisioned in Revelation 16:16, will occur. Coogan places the oldest and earliest versions of the epic in the 3rd millennium BCE. George Smith did his first public reading of Gilgamesh on December 3, 1872 in London. While some interpreted the finding as confirming the Genesis flood story, the New York Times reported the next day that the more likely conclusion to be drawn from the discovery of various traditions of the deluge, apart from the biblical one, is that the Noachian flood of Genesis 8 and 9 was legendary as well. And this is indeed the contemporary majority position among scholars, that the detailed parallels and similarities between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis flood narrative, especially the J flood story, confirm that the biblical writers made use of some pre-existing Mesopotamian flood stories. Fragments from another story were also found in Ashurbanipal's library. While this story took much longer to piece together, back in 1965, the epic of Atrahasis was published in English. It also contains a flood narrative, which is now thought to predate the flood story in Gilgamesh. Indeed, the deluge event in Atrahasis was likely the source of the flood narrative in the epic Gilgamesh, the Gilgamesh epic, because the flood story seems to have been a later add-on for Gilgamesh. The earliest known copy of Atrahasis dates to the 17th century BCE. Other flood stories that predate the composition of the Genesis narrative have now been found, further reinforcing the conclusion that the biblical writers were drawing upon ancient and widespread traditions when they included the flood story in their account of the Israelite primeval history. Another important find in Ashurbanipal's library was the Enuma Elish, from the first two words of the epic, when above. Its tablets were found in 1849, but were not deciphered and published until 1876. Lacking a flood story, it did not present the same immediate challenge to biblical inerrancy, and so did not create a stir. But in contemporary Hebrew Bible scholarship, it has proven vital to understanding Genesis. Enuma Elish cannot be definitively dated, but the general opinion is that it was first composed in the 16th to 19th centuries BCE. So how did the pre-biblical writers understand the human condition? Both Enuma Elish and Atrahasis both contain creation stories. The Atrahasis epic opens, when the gods, instead of man, did the work and bore the loads, the gods' loads were too great, the work too hard, and the trouble too much. After many thousands of years of such hard labor, the lesser gods persuaded the chief gods to make humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, thereby relieving the gods of their workload. In creating humanity, the gods forgot to make humans mortal. And after 600 years, the humans were overpopulating the world and were, in the language of the epic, noisy as a bellowing bull, disturbing the gods in their tranquility and causing them to lose sleep over the racket. That's also right from the epic. To remedy this disturbance, the gods decided to send a flood to destroy humanity, but the god Enki directs Atrahasis to build a boat to save himself, his family, and other living things. Specific details of the design of the boat are given to Atrahasis to ensure that it is up to the required task. To the annoyance of the other gods, Atrahasis successfully saves his family and the other living creatures. After the flood, the gods imposed random sterility and infant mortality to keep human numbers in check. In Enuma Elish, the supreme and pre-existing gods Apsu and Tiamat give birth to the lesser gods in a primordial realm preceding the present chaos, or present cosmos. A fierce but lesser god, Marduk, kills Tiamat and forms the cosmos out of Tiamat's body. Marduk then kills Kingu, Tiamat's divine consort, and used Kingu's blood to create humans to do all the work and toil that the gods had been doing themselves to nourish and sustain themselves. In this telling of cosmic origins, humans share in the divine substance and differ from the gods primarily by being less powerful and mortal. So today we've taken a deep dive into how the earliest Yahwist creation and flood narrative contained in the Hebrew Bible differs from the later narrative composed by the priestly writers. And we've learned that there was much earlier, very different conceptions of creation that existed in Mesopotamia, but have only recently been recovered. Next time, in part 3, we'll explore what the Israelite writers thought they were up to by rewriting the Mesopotamian stories the way they did. These ancient Israelite stories, along with those of the Greeks, ended up being the foundations of Western civilization, with echoes and ripples still felt today. So this is not just dry ancient history. It impacts how each of us still today, and next time we'll begin to explore how.
So I love hearing Bernie dissect these scriptures because it always takes me back to when I discovered that these texts were meant to be taken literally, and what that felt like. And initially it was a sense of despair. It was the sense of my world falling apart because I felt like nothing was spiritual anymore. I felt like when I learned that Genesis was a poem, it wasn't meant to be taken literally, from different authors that had political agendas, it hurt me because I felt like, what is sacred? But life is sacred. And most importantly, stories are sacred. Some of the most powerful stories that I've ever heard aren't literally true. I mean, from The Hobbit, we learned that it's not important that dragons are real or not, it's important that they can be slain. From The Golden Compass, we learned that it's not valuable to submit ourselves to corrupt institutions, and those institutions often distort the sacred and beautiful nature of life. From Moby Dick, we've learned that revenge is probably not a good idea. We've learned lessons from other stories like Winnie the Pooh, the value of friendship, and even The Lord of the Rings, how having a dear friend that'll sacrifice everything is the most important treasure that each of us can find. Just because these stories are literally true does not mean that they don't possess truth, powerful truths. And I invite you, I challenge you to look at Scripture this way. To look at it as a document that's, though it's not all literally true, there is mountains of truth in it. Specifically in the Gospels and in the teachings of Jesus. The most powerful stories, whether they're literal or not is irrelevant, that I have read are found in the teachings of Jesus. And one of the most sacred practices that I believe that we can do is communion, because it reminds us to reflect on the life of this subversive, non-violent disruptor of empire. Until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.